What happens when a single company becomes more valuable than most nations' economies combined? Last Tuesday at 4:47 p.m. Eastern Time, three of Wall Street's most powerful investment banks received a document that could reshape the entire space industry. The valuation figure at the top of page 1 made seasoned analysts pause. $1.5 trillion. Not billion, trillion. That's more than the GDP of Spain, Australia, or Mexico. And it's the price tag Elon Musk has attached to SpaceX's upcoming initial public offering, the largest in human history. But here's what nobody's saying publicly. If this succeeds, we're not just watching a financial transaction, we're witnessing the transfer of humanity's gateway to space from governments to a single private entity. Welcome back. For 2 decades, SpaceX has operated in the shadows of private markets, shielded from quarterly earnings calls and public scrutiny. That's about to change, and what Bloomberg reported this week reveals something far more significant than just another tech IPO. This isn't about stock prices, it's about who controls humanity's future beyond Earth. Let me take you back to December 9th when the first whispers emerged. Goldman Sachs, JPMorgan Chase, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley. These aren't just banks, they're the architects of every major public offering in modern history. And according to sources close to the deal, they've been instructed to prepare for something unprecedented, raising $30 billion in a single transaction. That would eclipse Saudi Aramco's $29 billion record from 2019. But here's what makes this different. Aramco sells oil, a commodity we've understood for centuries. SpaceX sells access to space, a frontier we're only beginning to comprehend. The numbers tell a story that even seasoned space observers find difficult to process. Current revenue estimates for 2026 place SpaceX somewhere between $22 and $24 billion annually. Most of that comes from Starlink, the constellation of satellites that now provides internet to over 3 million customers worldwide, from rural Montana to the battlefields of Ukraine. At a $1.5 trillion valuation, SpaceX would trade at roughly 60 to 68 times its annual sales. For context, that's 5 times higher than the company's valuation just 6 years ago when it was worth $30 billion in private markets. Some call this visionary, others call it madness. Ron Barron, the billionaire investor who's held SpaceX shares since the early days, told CNBC something revealing. He won't sell a single share at IPO, not one. Barron believes we're watching the early stages of a company that could grow tenfold over the next decade, reaching valuations that make today's number look conservative. Cathie Wood of ARK Invest goes further. She projects SpaceX could hit $2.5 trillion by 2030, driven entirely by Starlink's expansion into direct-to-cell service and global broadband dominance. But here's the question nobody's answering publicly. If SpaceX is worth $1.5 trillion, what does that make Musk? He owns 42% of the company. Do the math. That's $630 billion in SpaceX equity alone. Add his Tesla holdings, currently valued at $484 billion, and you're looking at the world's first trillionaire. Not in a decade, not in 5 years, potentially by late 2026. Think about that for a moment. One person controlling over $1 trillion in assets, most of it tied to space infrastructure and electric vehicles. We've never seen concentrated wealth at this scale in human history. The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts at their peak, they controlled fractions of what Musk is building. And unlike oil or railroads, space doesn't have geographic limits. But there's a crack in the foundation that Wall Street isn't discussing openly. SpaceX is fundamentally a hardware company, not a software platform. It builds rockets, satellites, ground stations. That requires massive capital expenditure, constant R&D, and carries risks that pure digital businesses don't face. When Tesla stock crashed in 2022, investors learned that Musk-led companies can be volatile. Now imagine that volatility applied to humanity's access to orbit. If SpaceX stumbles, if Starship development stalls, if a catastrophic failure grounds the fleet, there's no app update to fix it. You're looking at billions in losses and months of delays. That's the reality of aerospace, and it's why some analysts quietly call this valuation dangerously optimistic. Here's what makes this IPO genuinely historic, beyond the numbers. For the first time since the Apollo era, a single commercial entity will have more resources for space development than most national space agencies. NASA's entire 2026 budget is around $28 billion. SpaceX, after this IPO, would have raised more in one day than NASA gets in a year. Let that sink in. We're watching the privatization of human spaceflight, not gradually, but in one massive transfer of power from governments to a private corporation. Some see this as progress, the inevitable march of capitalism into the final frontier. Others see it as troubling, a future where access to space depends on quarterly earnings and shareholder approval. The timing isn't coincidental. 2026 is shaping up to be a pivotal year. NASA's Artemis II launches in February, returning humans to lunar orbit for the first time since 1972. China's planning major lunar missions. Europe's increasing defense spending includes massive satellite contracts. SpaceX wants to go public at the exact moment when space becomes strategically critical, not just scientifically interesting. That positioning gives them leverage with governments, telecommunications companies, defense contractors, anyone who needs reliable access to orbit. And right now, nobody else can match their launch cadence. Nobody. So here's the real question, and I want you to think about this carefully. Is SpaceX actually worth 1.5 trillion, or are we watching the greatest speculative bubble since the dot-com era? Write your answer in the comments. And here's what I want to know. Would you buy SpaceX stock at this valuation, or would you wait? Because unlike those early internet companies that crashed in 2000, SpaceX has real hardware, real customers, real revenue, but that 68 times sales multiple, that's venture capital math applied to aerospace. It's never been tested at this scale. We'll find out together, probably before this year ends, whether Musk's bet on humanity's future beyond Earth is visionary brilliance or spectacular overreach. Thank you for watching, and if you have thoughts on whether private companies should control our access to space, share them below. Until next time.